Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming this afternoon and to attend our event. Before we get going, I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered here today in the Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis. And as archaeologists and anthropologists as well, I think we can fully appreciate that for millennia past, there have been many people that have made this territory their home, and remember them. We remember them today as well. So. Before we get going, I just want to make a couple of announcements. First of all, this is lecture number 2 in our 50th anniversary series on archaeology and anthropology in an era of engagement and reconciliation. I'm going to give you advanced billing for number 3, which will be held on November 8th with Dr. Clint Westman talking about cultural politics of energy, community engaged environmental anthropology in Canada's tar sands. And there will be 2 more lectures in the new year as well, and we'll be sending out notices as that comes around. So I also want to remind you, if you haven't seen the notification already, that the department will be hosting a special event next Wednesday, October 24th in the Golden Oaks Red Bear Student Center, where we will be releasing our statement on reconciliation. It's at 4 p.m. We have a few speakers that will be speaking to the issue as well as we will formally release the statement. So we certainly would appreciate your support in attending this important event. So I'd like to now turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Terry Clark, who will introduce our guest speaker for today. I could just stand next to you.
We can only afford a 2 mic setup. Rudy's used to way more mics than this, I know. Thanks, Jim, and thanks for organizing this series. I think it's really important that we do this, that we recognize this. It's my distinct honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Rudy Reimer, Jomsk, who's a longtime colleague and friend. We must have known, it's coming on 20 years, I'm sure. Rudy is an associate professor at Simon Fraser University in the departments of archaeology and First Nation studies. He's an indigenous archaeologist from the Squamish Nation in British Columbia. He completed his PhD from McMaster University, linking archaeological science with oral history in Squamish lands. Rudy uses X-ray fluorescence to characterize the composition of lithic raw materials, particularly obsidian and ochre, and relates this to traditional Squamish stories about the importance of place, transformation, and mythical beings. More than most archaeologists, Rudy straddles the worlds of archaeological science and ethnography. He uses both these methods to tell important stories of the past that incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing. Rudy is also host of the critically acclaimed APTN series, Wild Archaeology. This series focuses on community-engaged archaeology across Canada, and just like Rudy's own research, it aims to bridge innovative science with Indigenous values and beliefs. This afternoon, Rudy will be speaking on archaeology and anthropology in the era of engagement and reconciliation. Rudy? Okay.
Hochika Tanaya, Siaman Siaits, Yumks, Queensna, Scott Oatbish, Osnachum, Rudy Reimer, Holaten Stachum, Hochika, Jim, Terry, Kayachton, Staltmouth, Saskatchewan. I just wanted to open my talk this evening, using my ancestral language from the Squamish Nation, just to say thank you to Jim and Terry for the generous introduction and invitation to be here. I don't come to Saskatchewan very often, but it's an honor to be here on the lands that, as Jim indicated, many Indigenous people have made their home over the several millennia. The Métis, the Cree, the Assiniboine, Blackfoot, and many others. And so that's why I use the word Staltmouth. That's our word in the Squamish language to refer to us as Indigenous people. Staltmouth in the Squamish language means human being. And so I wanted to acknowledge the Staltmouth Tameilch, and Tameilch being the land of the people, the Indigenous people who have been here for a very long time. So it's always an honor to acknowledge that and follow protocol. And this is something, as with this series, in the era of engagement and reconciliation, that is becoming more well-known. I don't want to say popular, but it's good to see that this is becoming common out at SFU. Many faculty and staff, are becoming more aware of our territorial acknowledgements and following protocols. And I always remind them that's just a first step. And so, writing, out at SFU Burnaby, many of them acknowledge the territories of Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Temiskaming, and Coquitlam. They say, well, that's just a step. Traditionally, if I were to properly, fully do this, within an Indigenous context, I would give you my family history. And so I would say many more things, and we'd be here a lot longer. So, but with that in context, I know we only have so much time this evening. I'm sure you're excited to hear more about wild archaeology, so I'll move on to that. And so I've given this presentation in various forms over the last 2 or 3 years now, but every time I am invited to speak about the series, I change it up and I focus on different things. So I know Terry knows quite a bit about the show. I hope some of you have seen some episodes or maybe seen the entire first season. So some of this may be a little bit review, but I hope that's okay. I also want to give you some indications of what's gone on behind the scenes while we've gone through season 1, and now just this past summer wrapped up filming season 2. And I'll give you sort of a sneak peek of season 2 at the end of my talk. So one of the things as an archaeologist that we need to acknowledge, when we look at colonial history or settler history, that is only just a sliver of the time of human history here on Turtle Island, or what we now call North America. Where here in Canada we use the term Aboriginal. The Aboriginal history here extends very far back. And so for me, as an Indigenous scholar, this is one of the main driving points that I have in my career, is to not only educate at a university setting, but also out to a public setting about what are some of the details that we can know about this 99.98% of Aboriginal history across the continent. So I just want to lead that in. This is mostly about archaeology. And as such, we have to acknowledge the dark history of archaeology here in North America. It was not the discipline that we know it today. And initially, many archaeologists, anthropologists worked as part of these huge expeditions. The Jesup North Pacific expedition was one, but there were many others that went all across the continent excavating and collecting material culture. And we have to put this into context historically. Yes, there were decimations of populations, continental scale, 90+% depopulation due to introduced diseases, smallpox, and so on. But even then, there were still many Aboriginal Indigenous people around, and many of the excavations that did occur were often done in secret. And here's a photo. This is Stanley Park, the famous Stanley Park in Vancouver, where Charles Hiltu and a crew of workers are they're not excavating. They were just shoveling out and obliterating the ancestral village site known as Hoi Hoi. And Hoi Hoi for Squamish, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh people of Burrard Inlet, we have shared territory. This is a very important place because this is where it's an origin place for our sacred, one of our sacred masks known as Shwai Shwai masks. And so in other areas, materials out on the West Coast and across the country, across the continent, these materials were often collected under duress from their home communities. People were sort of forced into selling their materials. And in other places, there's the top picture there, that's the Yuquot Whaler Shrine that was, quote, purchased in the late 1800s from the Nuu-chah-nulth people out on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And the bottom picture here This is a burial cairn just outside of modern-day Victoria, where many of these places were excavated, human remains and other materials were brought back to museums where they were stored, and yet still to this day, many of them have not seen the light of day. So it's this dark past that, anthropology and archaeology has, and it's good to acknowledge of what's gone on before. So it's within this context that, I just want to acknowledge the history of archaeology, but, let's move on in time into the 1960s and 1970s. Yes, archaeology was a discipline, anthropology was a discipline within institutions such as this and others. But then Indigenous scholars start coming to the fore and really critiquing what was going on. Vine Deloria Jr., as many of you probably know of, did this in quite an effective fashion through his seminal publications, Custer Died for Your Sins and Red Earth, White Lies. And as a result, I am glad that my predecessors in the disciplines of anthropology and archaeology responded to this. And so as a result, initially some people were really taken aback and were offended by his critique, but eventually the discipline began to change from within. Cecil King, as you can see in this quote here, about the process of anthropology and archaeology and what had been done to Indigenous peoples. And this is something that we, I think, sometimes forget about, that this is the legacy of what's gone on before us. And then, while we as researchers in modern day didn't do this, we are still responsible for it as anthropologists and as archaeologists. So I think it's really important to acknowledge this. So what was the response by anthropologists and archaeologists? Let's move into modern day. It was the formation of Indigenous archaeology. Really, it kind of had its roots in the late 1970s and 1980s, but it really began to flourish in the 1990s when Indigenous peoples became academic scholars in more number. And so what is Indigenous archaeology? Well, it's the archaeology done with, by, and for Indigenous communities. And prior to this, yes, many researchers, anthropologists, archaeologists did involve Indigenous peoples, but not to the scale, to the bar that Indigenous archaeology sets. It's not only just the involvement in excavation, but it's the analysis and care of material culture, ancestral remains, and other elements of cultural heritage. And it's really about addressing the inequities about the dark past that we have in our discipline and creating more of a balance between ourselves and Indigenous communities. And really, it's more than just basic consultation. And I'll expand a little bit about this as we go on. And it's really about handing over the power of research designs and who is setting the research agenda. So it's going into a community and asking the question instead of, I can do this for you, rather flip it around and say, what can I do for you? It's like, let them say, these are the areas that we need focused on. This is the concern of our community. And so what is also rewarding for me, having been at SFU now since 2009, teaching courses in archaeology and First Nation studies, is that seeing students graduate and go on and get jobs in cultural resource management or other sort of venues, and they've learned this through their degree. It's now an integral part of what we learn in anthropology and archaeology. And so they are moving on to jobs where they are the ones making management decisions. And I just hope that many of them keep the philosophy of what we've taught about Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous archaeology for many more years. And it's through, multiple cohorts of students over generations that this change will happen. So beginning to see that, and it's got a lot of promise. And so, there's even a coalition of Indigenous archaeologists that started in 2010 at the Society for American Archaeology. And really, it's about focusing on moving from basic consultation. When I first started in archaeology, there was, out in British Columbia, the way consultants did consultation was, sending a fax, making a phone call, and if no one answered, you could check the box and go, okay, I tried to consult with the First Nations community. Well, that isn't enough, right? And so sometimes academics and in other instances, cultural resource management people started to form partnerships with First Nations communities where there was more discussion that moved beyond just basic consultation. But now, in where we are here in 2018, many academics and even people in cultural resource management are seeking collaborations, meaningful collaborations where the community, the leadership, the elders, the knowledge keepers are setting the research agenda in a meaningful way. So I always like to acknowledge that spectrum, that we're not all at the same point. So, but acknowledging the history of archaeology and where we're at and how this has evolved, we still have more work to do. And so this leads into, why did I get involved in doing another TV show about archaeology? And it's one about the history of the discipline that I've just shared with you, but it's also this, I have to admit. Growing up, I loved Indiana Jones, not as a big fan of Tomb Raider, but it's more like shows on History and Discovery Channel now that I see. I'm just going, History Channel used to be good. Discovery Channel used to be good, and what has become of this? But these shows about the ancient past reach masses of people. And just a quick story, when the Society for American Archaeology was out in Vancouver a few years ago, a number of colleagues, we went out for beer, of course, after our papers were done for the day. And our server at the pub said, oh, how did they build the pyramids? And I said, well, they had plumb bobs and this and that and that, and you could lay it all out. And the response was, no, it was aliens. And I'm like, oh. So it just reinforced, I'm like, okay, TV and media are very important in our modern day. We all have social media of some form in our pockets or on our computers or on our TVs. So it reaches a lot of people and it has a profound impact about how we perceive the past. And it's not to say there have been other efforts on TV that are good, they're quality. The Time Team series, both the top one in the UK and the bottom one in the United States, were on PBS and had several seasons of promoting archaeology in a positive way. Particularly the American one. This is Joe Watkins, a very well-known Indigenous archaeologist who was my external examiner on my dissertation defense. And so, yeah, there are good examples out there, but it's these kinds of things that are in most people's minds. So really, how this all came to be, Wild Archaeology, as Terry alluded to in the introduction, it's a TV show about the science of archaeology and how that meshes well with First Nations cultural knowledge and their perspectives. And really, the main agenda goal of the series is to promote Indigenous archaeology through television. It's each episode, and I'll get into them as we move along, gives a voice to the community about their perspective and their values. And so I view wild archaeology as Indigenous archaeology in a new form. And thankfully, my tenure and promotion committee at SFU acknowledged that these episodes count for something. So that was good for me getting tenure, and I can say that now in the safety of my new position. Another reason why I wanted to do this, and yes, I publish peer-reviewed journal articles. This is one of my most recent ones. I do geochemistry of stone tools, linking them with cultural knowledge. But really, just to do a survey, how many people have read my paper from this past year? One. Okay.
We're just getting started. Give us some time.
Okay. Yeah. And so, yes, I love putting together research and going through the review process, and it feels great to have a journal article come out or a book chapter, and this is what we do as academics. But reaching out to a broader audience, having more of an impact. Ultimately, I would love if 20 people read this and maybe 10 people cited it. For me, that would be a success. but reaching out to having a TV show, episode after episode of, thousands of people watching across the entire country, to me, has a lot more impact in a different way. So how did this all come to be? In 2010, I was sitting in my office at SFU, I think it was marking papers, and I got a phone call from this lady, Tracy German, from Toronto. She's based at Sheridan College. It's a media college where you learn to be a cameraman or a sound person, etc. And she said, well, I got this idea, and she had tried it before and it didn't work out with other people in Ontario. And I said, well, I'm interested, because back in my MA when I was at SFU, me and my fellow grad students, we always used to go to the pub after the seminar and joke about doing a TV show in archaeology. And I was like, okay, 10 years later, now it's gonna happen. So as it turned out, I said to Tracy, well, I'm planning to defend my dissertation at McMaster in Hamilton later that year, and I'll be coming to Southern Ontario. So we had a meeting at Pearson Airport, and we hashed out our philosophy and ideas, and we all agreed, wow, this is great. So I defended my dissertation. She came out with a skeleton crew, camera person, sound person, and we filmed the teaser trailer that pitched to APTN, and we waited for months and months and months. And they eventually said, here's $1.6 million, go give us 13 episodes for season 1. And we all went, yay. But $1.61 million may sound like a lot, but it's not, because what we do in terms of the filming is just one aspect. There's a lot of post-production that goes on. There's a lot of other people involved. And so the season 1, we filmed in the summers in 2014 and 2015. And it was a bit, I'll go through some of the challenges and some of the behind the scenes things as I'll move along. And so before I got into all this, I found this book at another conference, Documentary Filmmaking for Archaeologists. And oh, perfect. And I picked it up. It's written by a filmmaker and an archaeologist, and it is a useful starter guide on how to go about doing this. But it's practical, yet it's very repetitive on how a filmmaker and an academic archaeologist could work together. And really, it's kind of a checkbox kind of approach of step by step, this is what you need to do. And I thought, well, they wrote this book in the light of, yeah, it's very repetitive, and I thought it would be better suited as a basic journal article. But I thought it missed a lot of key important factors in terms of Indigenous archaeology and doing responsible filmmaking. It didn't acknowledge Indigenous perspectives at all. And really, they wrote this book as a result of a one-off documentary, not in terms of an entire series. And so now I can say from my experience, every production, every set, every episode is a unique situation. It's very different from day to day, place to place, location to location. And so I acknowledge this as a good starting point, but it's not, it could be better. Maybe I'll write one that's better. That's a good idea. So who's involved in all this? Well, of course, me. I'm the archaeologist of the show. I guess I give it some sort of credibility, having some sort of academic position. So it's one of many things that I do. I do research in geochemistry. Here's our president of SFU. He often calls me or sends people in his office call me because I'm also responsible for a lot of academic circus at SFU, since I'm one of the very few Coast Salish scholars in the area. So I'm often called upon to help out with cultural events that happen on campus. But it takes a little time, but I find it advantageous because I have the ear of the president, who he and I are on first name basis. And the last gathering we had for the Orange Shirt Day, he gave me a big hug. And I was like, that was uncomfortable. So I guess I'm in his good books. I hope he sticks around for a while. But Jacob Pratt, he's Dakota Anishinaabe descent. He grew up just here in Saskatchewan, down in Regina. But he's now living in LA. He's seeking to become a big-time movie star, and I think he will be successful. He's a voice actor on many other shows. He flies a drone and does videography as well. He's a fantastic hoop dancer. He's done powwow since he was a little boy. He's a composer who's produced a number of CDs. He's now doing his master's degree down at, I forget the university in LA, but
He's at UCLA.
UCLA, yeah, thanks. And so he's got a bright future, and I'm sure he will go very far. And then the other co-host is Jennifer Brousseau. She's from the Serpent River, Ojibwe Nation down in Georgian Bay, Manitoulin Island area. She, I think, currently lives still in Vancouver. She wants to move back home to her home territory. She's an activist. She's a actor and singer who's done many productions on her own across the country. But she also has grown throughout the series to have an intensive interest in ethnobotany because she has Lyme disease, and she's seeking sort of traditional ways to deal with that through medicinal plants. And so more on these two as we move along. But then there's a whole big production team. This is just for season 1 of people who were involved in this. Tracy German up there is by the Thunderbird Pictograph. Really, wild archaeology is her baby. She works with Ian Thompson and Karen Hansen in sort of direction and writing and producing. And there's a whole list of names of people that we had for filming and sound throughout the first season. And one of the reasons why those people changed, as I mentioned earlier, every set, every location, every situation is very different. There were tensions between the directors and producers and some of the filming crew, so some of those folks did not come back. So that's typical in the business, though, as I've learned. There are different perspectives, different attitudes related to the situations that we're in. However, I enjoyed working with all these individuals, and I am still friends with them on Facebook and other social media. So where did we go for season 1? Some of you have probably watched the series, you probably know a little about what's happened, but I'll give you a little sort of behind the scenes of what some of the production was about. Episode 1, of course, I wanted to start. I said to Tracy, it's got to be in my home territory of the Squamish Nation. And originally, we were supposed to go up to the obsidian source of Inch Kai, as shown here in the bottom picture, which is Inch Kai is the big mountain in the background. And I thought, wow, you know, this is going to be a big TV production. We'll go up there in a helicopter, and, you know, we'll camp out at the lodge that BC Parks has. You know, be really comfortable, you know, eat good supper every night. And Tracy showed up and said, we don't have money for a helicopter. And I'm like, okay, well, it's a 11-kilometer hike in. Do you think you and your crew, these young guys from Toronto who've never been into the mountains, can do? And she's like, no. And they had just flown out, and we were supposed to go start filming the next day. So Tracy and I sat down that evening after supper and anxiously drinking some wine and going, okay, let's formulate a plan B. And plan B was to go to another alpine location that you saw in episode 1. And so as you saw in that episode, the snowpack, the weather, that time of the year, and the finances really changed what we had to do for that first episode. So it was a very important learning process for all of us. But really it helped us bond as a group to figure out things. It's like, okay, how is this going to move along? And yeah, we were up there in the middle of the summer. We went from the valley bottom, you know, you could see where we went up the logging roads as far as we could go, where it was summer, it was warm, it was July 4th. And then we got up into the Alpine, and it was still winter. So we went through all the seasons filming this one episode. And some of you might be wondering about the microblades that were found, like in the nice line. I think it's been brought up. I've been asked this before many times. I purposely put them that way just for production's sake. But those microblades, those obsidian microblades, are from that site. And there is a lab radiocarbon date to 6,900 years old for those materials. So yeah, episode 1 was a bit of a challenge. And As we moved on to episodes 2 and 3 up in White River First Nations territory in southern Yukon, this was our first experience of going as a crew into a remote location, right beside the Alaska Highway, but literally we were out in the middle of nowhere. And Norm Easton is an old friend and colleague from British Columbia. He's been working at the site in really strong, that word collaboration. He's been there for almost 30 years, working with the White River First Nation, excavating this site. And we now know that this is the second oldest site in Beringia. Dates to about 14,000 years ago. It's very important. And that word collaboration is very important here. Norm Easton is adopted into the White River First Nation. And one of their burial grounds is right off to the side of the Little John site where he's been working. And the community says, when you pass on, we're burying you there. And so that's just a testament to the energy and time put into how to establish a collaboration and how important those relationships are. And what's really fantastic, even at a young age, the kids from the community come out and excavate. And so by the time they're like 5 or 6, they're expert excavators and they can screen. They know what things are. It's fantastic. And of course, we could not go to that site until the snow had melted, but also things could be set up for us. This is the main excavation block of the Little John site. And Norm told us that we have to come at a certain time of year. So in terms of logistics, going to locations, we can't just decide, oh, we'll be there on this date to this date. There are things like this that people in the field have to deal with. So we have to work in close partnership collaboration with the lead archaeologists of each episode. So Norm refers to this as the pit of despair. And just being there, for me as an archaeologist, working on a site that dates to 14,000 years ago, this is some of the oldest material in North America that you can dig up. Was a fantastic experience. And this young lady here, we're doing XRF on the sediments of the site using the portable XRF. She was one of my honor students at SFU, so it was good to meet up back with her and do some work. She's originally from northern BC. Southern Yukon area. And so due to some technical and financial reasons, I was not part of episode 4 and 5 because the crew, in these episodes, I say, Jen, Jacob, I'm sending you on a solo mission. Well, Tracy didn't have enough money and there was not enough room on the boats to get everyone up to the Mackenzie Delta and Richardson Island. And where Max Friesen from the University of Toronto has been working desperately with his crew, his team there, to excavate these whalebone houses, two-lay houses that date to the last 400 or 500 years ago, because they are literally melting into the ocean. So when we talk about evidence of climate change and global warming, here it is and its impact on archaeology. The permafrost is melting, and these sites with incredible preservation of organic materials are literally washing away into the Arctic Ocean. So, the main reason we were there is to document. This is evidence of climate change, of sea level rise and its impact on archaeology. And fortunately, Max Friesen and his crew, again, he's working in close collaboration with the Inuit groups up there. And really, without them, our crew, Jen, Jacob in particular, would have had a very difficult time completing these 2 episodes. Episode 6, Jen went home to her home community, so it was just Jacob and I. I got to work with my friend and colleague on the top picture, Dr. Lisa Sonnenberg, who was working with faculty at the University of Michigan doing underwater archaeology in the Great Lakes. And they've been doing bathymetric mapping of what's underneath the water to find out the ancient landforms there. And really, they found these ancient bridges that connected southern Ontario to Michigan over 10,000 years ago. And more fascinatingly, they found these lines of rocks that were in what they were not natural features. And so they sent divers down and submarines to map them. And also, very interestingly, the local First Nations communities there speak of a time when there was sort of a tunnel ridge that connected where they were to their relatives that were now over in Michigan. So they had deep oral history about these ancient landforms. And here's a bathymetric ridge. You can see Apolena Amberley Ridge. That's where they're doing their research. So at the time, 12,000 years ago, the lake levels in the Great Lakes were a lot lower. The water was draining more faster and in different ways. And so as a result, this Apolena Amberley Ridge was exposed. And as a result, animals, caribou, were migrating back and forth. And what we know about caribou hunters, particularly from the Arctic and subarctic, is that they use, very similar to here on the plains, drive lanes. And those rock features that they were finding along this now submerged ridge were underwater. And people, here's a map of some of them. You can see the lines, and you can see the circular features. Those are hunting blinds. And there's a photo, B, of what they look like underwater. So they have probably some of the most ancient drive lanes on the continent submerged underwater in the Great Lakes. And Lisa Sonnenberg, she went down and dove to those locations where the hunting blinds are, and she took some cores of sediment in several locations, and she pulled that up, brought it up to the surface, brought it back to the lab, sorted through it, and this is what archaeologists refer to as microdebitage. This is from manufacturing of stone tools. So we have direct human evidence people were there when these were exposed ridges. So it's pretty fascinating archaeological research that uses science to map underwater features that meshes with local First Nations oral history about caribou hunting, using these drive lanes, traveling back and forth on a seasonal basis well over 10,000 years ago. Close by, up on Manitoulin Island, we went up there because many of the lithic materials that Lisa was finding in those cores, where they come from. Dr. Pat Julig from Laurentian University has been working at the Shugwinda quarry site for many, many years. And so he taught Jen and Jacob how to make stone tools, but we also took some of the material from the Shugwinda quarry site, and Pat Julig did geochemical testing on it, and many of the materials from those microdebitage are from the Shugwinda quarry. So this gives us further evidence of human landscape use in the ancient past, tying to those oral histories about hunting on those ancient ridges. Jen also got to go back to her home community at the Serpent River, and we showcased some of what was going on in her home community, particularly the powwow there, where we had a great time. We filmed Jen and Jacob doing. Does everyone know what the potato dance is? You have a couple of people, you get together and you put a potato and you do these fancy moves, and the potato cannot fall. Anyhow, they came in third place, which wasn't too bad. So we do have fun when we're doing all this as well. It's at this point in the series, we're establishing Jen and Jacob, having these friendly competitions, and me being the judge of the quality of what they were doing. But episode 8, we got to go out to the central coast of British Columbia. My friend Farid Ramtula from the University of Northern BC, he was one of my fellow grad students who talked about how doing this TV show in archaeology, so I had to involve him. But he was working with the Hakai Institute, who has a lot of money. This is the entrance to the institute on Calvert Island, where Farid and his field school were excavating a nearby site that was over 5 meters deep. And it was crazy going to this lodge. I forget the name of the fellow. Terry, do you remember his name? Yeah. But he was there to greet us with his wife. Does anyone remember from the 1970s the show Fantasy Island? A few of us older gray hairs. walking onto this island where he bought up this old fishing lodge for millions of dollars, and he created it into this research place that is self-sufficient off the grid. It runs on geothermal and solar power, but there's helicopters, there's boats, and everything you could dream of. And you walk onto the island, and he's there to greet you. He says, "Welcome to the Hakai Institute. If there's anything you want, just sign the form, and you can go and do whatever you want." And it was crazy. So we got to do a lot of things in terms of financial support that we would not be able to do without his help. And also the food there at the lodge, they had a 5-star chef. And Farrad and I joked, it's like, this is the only archaeological project that you could work on where you actually gain weight. Because when we go into the field, we tend to work pretty hard, physically hard labor, and we don't have time to eat that much. So we tend to come back after summer like being carved out of wood, right? But not on this one. It was great to, there's Farrad at the bottom of one of his excavation units. That's about 5 meters down. And also the other picture here, there's Elroy White, who we went and did the next episode with. So here, it just showcased, intensive excavation methodology and radiocarbon dating of an intensively occupied site that now we know goes back at least 9,000 years. But it was an honor to work with Elroy, also shown here in the picture. We went to the site of Namu and others in his home territory. He gave us a tour of Heiltsuk territory and gave his perspective through oral history and place names and how he views the archaeological record as an indigenous person working in his territory. And really, Elroy is caught up in a lot of the management decisions about the many developments that are now impacting the Central Coast. But it was great to meet up with Elroy. He and I are good friends and colleagues. And it was also very interesting to go back to Namu, which is another site that's been excavated. It's very well known in Northwest Coast archaeology. It goes back 9,000-10,000 years. But it's become very overgrown. And there was a historical cannery at the site, as you can see in the top picture there, that has become very toxic. There's stuff leaching out. So it's become a very important issue for the Heiltsuk Nation in terms of environmental management. And also here, this is Kwe. It's an educational camp for the Heiltsuk Nation where they send their youth. It's a cultural camp where they learn about their traditional culture and practices. And this is where Elroy started his sort of academic career before he moved on into archaeology. So it was an incredible tour of that part of the coast. It's pretty hard to get to otherwise. And of course, close to home here for you folks, this is over in Alberta at Head Smashed In. It's a World Heritage Site. I had the great tour. I'm going to mispronounce it. Wiskewin? Earlier today, and that was a great experience. I think that, sites like that are equally as important. But prior to getting the landscape tour of Head Smashed In by Jack Brink, the provincial archaeologist of Alberta, we spent about a day and a half with Blackfoot elder Reg Crowshoe, sitting in his teepee in front of his house in his yard, learning about the cultural protocols regarding buffalo and the roles of men and women in traditional Blackfoot society. And it was particularly exciting for Jacob. He bought a new drone, and some of the footage that you see in this episode was his drone flying of giving the perspective of the buffalo going over, and down the cliff and what it would have been like before you went splat at the bottom. But it was an incredible experience being out there with Jack. He's got decades of archaeological experience, and he knows this archaeological and cultural landscape intimately. And so it was a fun time walking around with him and also hearing some of the very similar things that Reg had shared with us, where some of the commonalities between cultural knowledge and archaeological perspectives could come together. And some of the footage that we shot also a lot of what we do, we're on set for each episode for about 2 to 2.5 weeks. So the 22 minutes that you get to watch there's a lot of other footage that we take. There are scenes that are written into the scripts and the narratives that do not end up into the episodes. And it's kind of unfortunate because there was some other stuff. We came over to Saskatchewan. There's just over from the border of Provost. There's a herd of buffalo being kept for food purposes, and filming buffalo stones, their rubbing stones, and so on. But we also went to Bodo, the archaeological center there, and we planned to film an entire episode there, but it just didn't work out in terms of content and material. So, we spent 2 weeks at Bodo thinking that it would be a full episode, but it just didn't transpire. So there's a lot of work that, I want to acknowledge that goes into a lot of this that just doesn't end up in the final episodes. And of course, we do other things. We do have some downtime, get to play pool. There's Jacob doing a hoop dance, National Indigenous Day at Head Smashed In. We do get short breaks from time to time on set, and have some friendly competitions. There's Jacob losing the constructing one of the blinds at Head Smashed In. But as some of you might remember, Jen bribed me with chocolate in that episode. And of course, we do have bad days on set where I have to set people straight. This is me using my force powers to set some of the crew in line, get your act together. This is called vadering. It was very popular about 10, 15 years ago, where you get people to jump up and you do the Darth Vader thing. And so, anyhow, we do goof around quite a bit. The last few episodes of season 1, we went out to Labrador and Newfoundland. It was a pleasure to work with Scott Nielsen, who is now tenure-track faculty at Memorial University. He's based in Labrador and works closely with the Sheshatshiu Innu First Nation out in that part of the world. And this was fascinating because here we're about 150 kilometers away from the modern-day shoreline of Labrador. And just off in the distance, you can see there's that break and slope. That's an old shoreline that dates to about 3,000 years ago. And this is the result of the end of the last ice age, the land rebounding out of the water of the ocean. And so Scott's PhD dissertation focused on mapping these ancient shorelines that go 100, 150, 200 kilometers into inland Labrador. And he's found a very nice sequence of ancestral Sheshatshiu Innu occupations all throughout their territory. And what was really hauntingly weird about filming this episode, it's a subarctic environment, and it's Labrador. And I've been to the subarctic of British Columbia and the Yukon, and literally it's exactly the same. It was kind of eerily odd being in that environment. It felt like I could be in northern BC as opposed to being way out in Labrador. But fascinating place. Jacob was a hero. The Sheshatshiu Innu group, the Indigenous people of Labrador have only been living on reserves for the last 40 to 50 years. And the impacts of trying to convert to a modern day mode of European, Euro-Canadian living is phenomenal. And so another thing that Scott does with people in the community is that they're trying to build modern day housing on the reserves. And there's Jake applying his drone, showing off to the kids. And so prior to construction, there's an entire excavation of where the footprint of the house is going to be. And so they're doing their own archaeology. But they're still trying to practice their traditional life ways, going out and hunt caribou, fish, and so on. And the houses that are being built do not meet the requirements. And so it was really kind of depressing to see what was going on in their community and many of the other sort of social issues that they are having that are very common in other First Nations communities across the country. But there it was just much more apparent because of that more recent experience of literally with a couple of generations removed from their lands. And so that was kind of hard to take. The final 2 episodes of season 1, we went out to Labrador, to Southern Inuit, site that Lisa Rankin from Memorial University was working on. And this is a fascinating example of the mixing of cultures of indigenous people of Inuit, Inuit houses, and European men marrying into those communities. And so how the distribution of material culture within those houses still fell in line with indigenous patterns, where there, specifically within the houses, there were several areas of where women had their space, and men's spaces tend to be outside of the house. And this continued on even after the intermarrying of European men with indigenous Inuit women. So excavating these houses was quite informative to me. I've not done much Arctic archaeology, but the bugs were particularly bad, and of course the weather was quite cold. But it was an incredible experience to be out there working on a site with incredible preservation. And so yeah, you know, there's a lot of archaeologists, a lot of topics, archaeological topics that we cover throughout the entire first season. We did have our trials and tribulations of traveling all across the country, various people's attitudes, not seeing eye to eye, various issues that came up between people and the crew. Sometimes that was hard to deal with. And for me in particular, being away from home was one of the biggest challenges. This is out in Labrador at Riglet, which is a very small community, fishing community, southern Inuits peoples, and this is their salmon celebration. The Atlantic salmon are actually making a comeback, and so they're harvesting salmon again out there, wild Atlantic salmon, not farmed. And of course, being home away from my family and my young daughter, I always kind of gravitate to kids when I visit these communities. And they were serving up caribou stew, and there I am enjoying my stew after being out on the cold boat. And I said, "What do you want? Do you want some stew?" And they're like, "No." "What do you want?" "Giant cookie." So they were selling giant cookies. I bought all the giant cookies, and they got to eat them. But yeah, for me, it's being away from home. That's the major challenge for me. 2-3 weeks away from home, my young daughter and my wife, and other family. That's a main challenge to me. You know, family means a lot, and getting home after filming some of these episodes was quite enjoyable. But of course, you know, as my fellow crew members, we forge strong friendships, and we overcome many challenges that we face while doing all of this. And of course, there's a lot of post-production. There's an entire year of post-production for each season. And in season 1, Jacob and his aunt did voice overdubbing. And so the entire first season is overdubbed in Dakota. And so I'm hoping to do season 2 to get some of my cousins who've been revitalizing the Squamish language through SFU and the linguistic programs there that we just started to do overdubbing in Squamish. And we're hoping to do this more with other First Nations communities because this is APTN, it's Aboriginal People's Television Network. We need to convey things in Aboriginal languages, and for us that's very important. So if you know people in communities that want to do this, I can connect them with Tracy, the producer of the show. And really, I want to acknowledge, this is just season 1. These are all not all, but the prominent people, the Indigenous people in their communities that really, without them, this entire series would not be possible. It was a pleasure working with all of them, hearing their perspectives about their history, their culture, their community, their ties to the land, and how that links with archaeology. And what I really hope, if you've watched a few episodes or seen the entire season, is that I hope that what we were trying to do is tell their story along with the archaeological story, you know, as being on par with each other. I hope that you see that we've achieved that. And just to give you a sneak peek of season 2, this is an old slide, I should have updated. We finished filming season 2 this past summer. And there's another year of post-production, so by this time next year, you'll be watching more and more episodes. But we went across the country yet again. These are all going to be sort of these panoramics. We went to Rice Lake, just outside of Peterborough. where we focused on the traditional harvesting of wild rice and the importance of that material there. We also went to the Serpent Mounds, an example of, going back to the dark past of archaeology, where burials from these intricate mound sites were dug up without the consultation or involvement of local First Nations communities, and how that is being rectified. And of course, sorry it's a bit washed out, Terry, but we went to Sechelt territory, and it was a pleasure to work with Terry and the colleagues and friends and relatives in the Sechelt Nation to examine, showcase the defensive site that Terry's working on, and of course the beads and the museum and all the research that Terry's been involved in. I'm really looking forward to seeing that. Maybe that might even be 2 episodes. We covered a lot, so it's some episodes turn into 2, other episodes get cut down, and it's sort of a fluid process. We got to come out here to Saskatchewan, down to the area of East End, Shaunavon, focusing on more recent archaeological time periods. Dr. Keisha Supernot, University of Alberta, is doing Métis archaeology. Particularly, we showcased the research that she's doing at Chimney Coulee, just outside of East End, but also the surrounding landscape. And I always thought Saskatchewan was really flat. But going here to this part of your wonderful province, I had a great experience seeing some of the elevation and some of the dynamic changes in the landscape that is out here. Though I did not like the ticks, I have to say. I did get one in my hair, but it didn't bite me, so I'm safe. We went back east to Quebec, just outside of Montreal, to Kahnawake, to showcase the community, the research, and issues that they've had there over many years. But this is, oh, my memory is starting to go. This is in Châteauguay, where Dr. Just forgot his name. He also does XRF and geochemistry, but he's doing a very important public archaeology field school at this site, Ile Saint Bernard. The building in the back, this is an old nunnery. It converted into a hotel, and it was kind of eerie. This is where we stayed for this episode. And me, Jen, and Jacob were saying, this is kind of like, feels like a residential school. It's kind of got this creepy vibe to it. So we didn't really like staying there, but it was very convenient for all of us because the excavation that was going on there goes back to the woodland archaic and meshes with really important cultural knowledge from the Iroquois peoples there about how they changed locations of their villages in relation to more recent fur trade, but also the location of the rapids along the St. Lawrence River, and how that all played a role within the more recent fur trade in historic times, but the ancient trade of lithic materials throughout the eastern woodlands areas more broadly. And then we went up to the Arctic. We went up to Nunavut, to Iqaluit on Baffin Island. Incredible Arctic landscape, focusing on a very important project that the Inuit Heritage Trust has initiated on the island of Quinamarvit, where it's an island, about an hour-and-a-half boat ride outside of Iqaluit, where there are whalebone houses. And it's a territorial interpretive archaeology park. And their idea there is to promote tourism to get more economic development for their community, is to excavate an entire whalebone house and then rebuild the whalebone house using whalebone and other materials. And okay, just a warning, some of the coming slides are a bit gruesome. It has to do with Inuit whaling. So just to give you a warning, there is some cutting up of a very large whale. So if that gives you trouble, please avert your eyes. Here's the whalebone house being excavated by a team of archaeologists from Alberta, and also, oh geez, I'm forgetting people's names. Maybe if I see a picture of him. No, he's not in here. He's now retired, but he had worked with the local communities for several decades, and he came out of retirement to take part in this project. And so here you can see there's whale bone as part of the structural elements of this house. And so the idea was to excavate everything that was the house and underneath it, because the archaeology branch of none of it was saying don't damage any of the other archaeology. So they excavated the entire house. They found lots of stuff, Thule occupation, Dorset occupation. People from the community were doing the archaeology. They were taking part in the decisions about how to excavate the site, what parts of the house should be excavated or not, and so on. And then you might ask, well, where are they going to get the material to build this whalebone house? It went crazy. They had been planning a bowhead whale hunt for weeks. They had been monitoring the movement of whales up and down the inlets, and they were successful. When one of these, there were people in our camp, we were out on this island, and everyone left. And I was left alone for one night on my own. I said, where did everyone go? And I was like, okay. Then eventually people came back and they said, yeah, we got the whale. So I went out on a boat and wearing one of these survival suits and got to witness the whale hunt. And it was an incredible experience. They hunted it, they speared it, they towed it back to close to Hallowit, they beached it up. I helped pull this whale up using the tide and boats. It took 8 hours. And me and others were working on these lines. But it was an incredible experience to feel the energy, the living culture of the Inuit people over these few days. And once they got it up to the high tide mark, they went to work right away. And I'd learned from ethnographies and so on that they would carve up these whales in a specific way, and certain people in the community who are higher status got certain pieces of the whale, and this was going on. I was witnessing it firsthand. So it was an incredible experience, and this fellow here, his name is Nulloch. He was the head of the hunt, and he's also the steward of the island that we were staying on. He is about 65, 70 years old. His father is still alive, who had just passed down the stewardship to him, who he's about 100 years old. But they are still going out on the boats and doing these things. So it was really incredible to see Inuit culture alive and well. And I really, and myself and others on the crew really relied on these people for our survival as well. And I just want to acknowledge that. So really incredible experiences, give you a sneak peek of season 2. But to tie this all together, reconciliation, really, I think wild archaeology, in terms of when we talk about TRC, I think this series really hits on many of the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Education. I show these episodes in my classes in First Nation Studies and archaeology and in other contexts. It talks about reviving language and culture. We're doing that. We're using language in our episodes. We're showcasing Indigenous cultures across the country. Museums and archives. We're looking at material culture and the management of those materials. But also, I think this is an incredible way to commemorate Indigenous cultures across the country, to showcase that, yes, there is an ancient past, but also we as Indigenous peoples are still alive and well. And of course, most importantly, the media, going back to changing perspectives, getting people, don't watch Ancient Aliens, watch wild archaeology. So for me, I think, you know, the calls to action, I hope that you share my opinion that we're meeting some of these through this TV series. But also, this is also at SFU, we have a Aboriginal Reconciliation Council who's recently written our report and has many other calls to action that I hope Indigenous students coming to SFU or this University of Saskatchewan view this TV show as in a positive light, that creating safe places and cultural spaces, which I got a tour of earlier today as well. That's great. You've got that building over there. We don't have that at SFU yet. We have some other things that you don't have, but I think when we're talking about indigenizing curricula and the institutions, it's good to come here to see what you've done and share what some of the things that I've done. So we're kind of in this together as anthropologists, as archaeologists, academic institutions. What can we learn from each other? So in that regard, I'd like to say thank you again for inviting me here to share this and many other things. And if you want to watch more about wild archaeology, here are some web links. I'm also on another show on APTN called 1491. It's based on a book by Charles Mann, and also another program on Knowledge Network about Mounted Ziza, that you can have these web links and binge watch to your heart's content. There's no commercials, right? So it's easier. So I'll just close by saying, on Halloween in Squalawen, Wachikat Tanayap, Siam and Siates, wake up yo. So that's Squamish for thank you for listening, respected friends, colleagues. You all take care. How was that for time?
That was good. That was great. I think we have some time for some questions for Rudy. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming here. We do love wild archaeology. My question is, we've experienced some mistrust of the Native community towards archaeology. What was it like for you becoming an archaeologist? Did you have a lot of pushback from your friends and family and community? That you're going to be one of them now?
Yeah, my first experience on reserve, growing up, I was actually born in Southern Ontario, and we ended up in Squamish when I was a young kid. And it was good to get back to my community, but when I was quite young, my mom took us to museums. She exposed me to many different things. And when we moved back to Squamish in the early 80s, it wasn't until the later 80s, a consulting company that had been hired by the Squamish Nation, they were known as Arcus at the time. They were now bought up by AMEC, one of the big companies. They were doing land claims research for Squamish Nation. And they came onto the reserve of Stotness, which is just south of Squamish, where I grew up. And they were digging shell midden and house deposits there. And I went over when they were working, and some of the elders came out and they said, "No, you don't go over there. That's they're digging up the ancestors. Stay away." And I think they were, at the time, I thought they were telling me, stay away from the archaeologists, but I think they were more looking out for me as a young child in terms of the spiritual aspect. Don't go over there because that's where the ancestors are. And so I didn't have the tummuth or the ochre to put on for protection. But also, when I started out academically, I wanted to be a geologist, but I failed calculus in college. And did anthropology that same semester, and I was really got it, enamored with that. And so my instructor said, there's an archaeology field school this summer that you can go on. I said, is there enough credits so I can get funding from my band? And he said, yes. And actually, a couple of my other cousins were taking it. And so we all went out and dug up at Fort Langley, a historic site. But also it had pre-contact material going back 9,000 years. And from that field school, I was bitten by the archaeology bug. But as I progressed throughout my career, people in the community came to know that I was doing archaeology as a degree, and they found it kind of fascinating. Some of them were going like, "Oh, you're going to dig up the bones, right?" I'm like, no, we don't want to dig up burials, right? And I had to explain what I was learning in my classes at Cap College and at SFU, that we don't want to do that anymore. We're trying to change the discipline. And so that kind of helped me get through some of that. And also, right after I finished my field school, I got a paid job in archaeology, doing a salvage excavation of the Locarno Beach site right down in Kitsilano in Vancouver for 2.5 weeks. And so I thought it was great. It's like right out of a field school, and I was like, here's a paid job. Right, I don't have to work in the crab factory that I'd been suffering at for weeks. So maybe I think my experience is a little different, and maybe I kind of attribute to what my mom did when I was quite a bit younger. And one of the slides, there was a cover of a book I showed, Being and Becoming Indigenous Archaeologists. That was edited. It's a compilation of Indigenous archaeologists from around the world who share their experiences of how they came to be where they are. And I have a chapter in there. So you can look that up and you can kind of read my archaeological biography. So, yeah.
Some more questions? Pam?
Thank you very much for this. This was fascinating to hear the sort of behind the scenes and overview of wild archaeology. And I'm wondering if you are able to say a little bit about the reception to the series. Has it drawn some political attention? Has the series been useful for those who politically advocate?
Good question. I think we all had some apprehension going into the first season because we didn't know really what to expect when we were going into different communities. And I think Tracy did a very good job of sort of setting us up. Like doing Squamish first was easy because I'm from there. And then I knew Norm Easton very well for many years, and he had that long collaboration relationship with the White River First Nation. And then as we went along, we overcame some of those initial challenges so we could overcome other ones later on. But I think legally, politically, out of the first season, a lot of the communities that we went to, they found it very advantageous to have this kind of on air, like showcasing their history, some of the issues about their heritage. And as such, in season 2, communities were asking, come, we have a story to tell as well. And in season 1, we were hoping to get up to Sechelt because of the research that Terry was doing, the incredible burials with thousands, literally hundreds of thousands, like incredible archaeology. But at the time, I don't think the community was ready.
No, they weren't. And you're exactly right. We did talk to them, we did approach them, but they were apprehensive. Seeing the series, the first season come out, I think was great, and they were super proud to be part of the second season. So they were like, okay, these guys know what they're doing. This is going to be okay for us. But they were apprehensive for sure.
Yeah. So I think it depends on the community and the situation of what's going on. So that's why I do a lot of work up front with Tracy, of identifying archaeologists and projects in different areas. What would be easier or what would be more difficult. And I have to admit, the stuff that we did in the Arctic in the last few episodes for season 2, that was very difficult because there were several logistical problems. There were health issues. We were all in a big canvas tent, for example, and they brought in one of these Coleman stoves and said, just light it up to warm up the tent for a little while. And I said, okay, I'll make sure I know what, because of the fumes, the carbon monoxide, and don't leave it on because all the tents are sealed. And so I went to sleep early, as I usually do. And I told the crew, I said, last one up, turn the stove off. And they didn't. And Jacob got carbon monoxide poisoning. Tracy got very sick, carbon monoxide poisoning. And one of our lead camera guy, Owen, felt very sick as well. So there were those kinds of issues as well that, because when everyone left for the whale hunt, we were kind of left on our own. And some people on our crew just didn't know what to do. So there's multiple other stories I could share. But I think for the most part, there are other communities that we wanted to work with. For example, there's the ice patch archaeology going on in the Yukon and Northwest Territories. That is incredible. We wanted to get in there. I do alpine archaeology in British Columbia, and so I was really keen on that. But for them, it's still too sensitive at this time. There's stuff going on probably between the archaeologists and the community and people within the community that needs sorting out. So we don't want to come in and go, hi, we got a camera. So that's why I work with Tracy and other people in the production team to go, okay, this is a good situation, let's go here. This might not work, let's leave that for now. So, yeah.
Jim?
Thanks, this is fabulous. I'm wondering, do you encounter protocol issues with respect to what you can say regarding a community in the archaeology and what you can show on camera?
Yes, that's come up a number of times. Typically, if we want to show something, we need approval from elders or community leaders. A lot of that is drafted out. We don't have a script per se for each episode. It's more called a treatment. Here's the narrative. This is what we want to showcase. This is what we would like to find and do. And since it's active archaeology, we're literally excavating and uncovering the stuff on the camera. Very seldom is it like the microblades. That was just done for, we had to do something because of the issues that we had in the challenges of that first episode. But we're again up in the Arctic. Inuki, who is Nuluk's father, they're the stewards of that island. Before we had to have a meeting before going to the island just to make sure to get their permission, because they are the stewards, to say when it is excavated, they were supposed to be the ones to see it first because it's their ancestors. Inuki, who's the 100-year-old elder, he grew up in one of those houses, so it's a very, very close connection, and so. But at the same time, we are under time deadlines. The archaeologists were on time deadlines. We were on time deadlines for filming. And so we did a lot of filming where he did not get to see the stuff first. And that actually became a bit of an issue, but it got resolved. And so Nuluk and others talked about it. And hopefully a lot of that footage, because we got a lot of it, and it's incredible. That we can showcase it, hopefully, in 2 episodes, because there's just so much there. It's such an important story to tell about their close ties to their ancient history. And it's happened in season 1 and season 2, where following traditional protocol, kind of, meeting the aims of Indigenous archaeology, we want to follow those protocols. And also acknowledge, Tracy has that bridge to walk between what needs to be done to fulfill the contract of what is required for the series, but also to make sure that the communities feel that what the story that we're telling and what ends up on the TV is what they want. And so another example, the Heltzuk, for the 2 episodes on the Central Coast, they reviewed the entire footage and had a say on, what is the story? What's the narrative of those episodes? So that's what we strive to do.
More questions?
Oh.
I was just wondering, so obviously with Indigenous communities, with this type of work, you've listened to a lot of oral tradition and oral stories of, I guess our origins basically. So I'm just wondering how you found a balance, because there's a lot of criticism from Indigenous scholars that this type of science demythologizes and kind of invalidates oral traditions, but at the same time, if you use this type of science to validate the stories, it almost seems patronizing. So I'm just wondering how you found that balance.
Yeah, it can work both ways, for good or worse, right? And we really have to be careful of that, myself included. And it's a careful balance that archaeology is still trying to cope with, I think. When we talk about the initial peoplings of Turtle Island or North America, that it goes back this far. The Little John site being the second oldest site in Beringia at 14,000, whereas, many Indigenous people say we've been here since time immemorial. And that comes up very often. And that's where I try and find some synergies where, in Squamish, we use the term Swakhwiam. And Swakhwiam is a term for our oral history, our stories, our legends, whatever you want to call them, of the earliest times where we'd been created, when we were placed in our territory, when our first ancestors fell from the sky, and in 4 different locations throughout our territory. what I try and do, at least from an archaeological perspective, of go, where are those Squamish places where we can find that deeper connection to the culture and the community? And maybe it will never mesh with, the time frames that archaeologists use and the concepts of time that Indigenous people have. But where we can find those connections, I think it gives both archaeologists and First Nations communities a better, greater understanding of the past, where one is not given more weight than the other, where it's on par. And so it's a challenge, and there's a lot more that can be done. So I hope that kind of answers your question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
On Monday, my band, Sturgeon Lake First Nation, is going to have like a meeting talking about archaeological digs. And I'm actually going to go there. And I kind of want to make a point to say what's positive about having archaeology, like in the reservation. And is there any kind of more pros that you can give me?
Yeah, well, I think there are a few things, like what Scott Nielsen is doing out in Cheshire, I have this problem in my home reserve at Squamish, where people build their house and they dig up ancestral remains. I'm like, what are you doing? So getting the archaeology done first before residential development, that would be a positive. It would also, there could be an exchange, a meaningful exchange between archaeologists and people in your community. There could be economic benefits. People could get jobs and training out of this to understand what archaeology is about, more than, say, ancient aliens or, maybe, the changes that archaeologists have done to be more than just, quote, grave robbers or bone diggers, to go, archaeology can be done in a positive light, to also, having the community say, well, this is the archaeology we want to be done, not what you come in and say, this is what I want to do. Reverse that, empower your community to have those, to create the research design, to create the management decisions. Where are the artifacts going to go? Are they going to, how are they going to be studied? And, make sure to have people in place at every stage of those processes. And I think you would be an ideal person to do that. So that would be probably, the thing. And, one thing that I like about doing archaeology, in a positive light, is to help revitalize our cultures, be it through language, through getting out on the land, talking about place names, talking about our histories and how that relates to archaeology. And I do this with cultural camps up in Squamish, where we bring out the youth, and sometimes we just talk about really simple stuff, salmon, and, the archaeology of salmon or something like that. So it can work at many different levels.
One last question. Okay, I've got one.
I knew it.
Yeah, of course. But your computer shut down. I was going to make you go back
Okay.
to your first slide.
My very first slide?
Well, the Thunderbird pictograph. Because I noticed something that I'd never noticed before. This is a very famous rock art panel. I thought it was right at the beginning.
Was it the picture with Tracy?
No, it was that one. Yeah, but
This
the
one?
whole thing. You have a bigger picture of it?
Do I?
Yeah, it's like your second slide.
That's my
Your third slide. I don't know where it was. All right, you know what it looks like.
Yes.
So I've got a grad student who just finished her master's degree in Shishal Territory, looking at female puberty sites. And so she looked at Coast Salish, what Coast Salish women, young women do. And so one of them is they make pictographs. And they're absolutely, I don't know if you noticed this, but there is a fir needle female pictograph on that panel, which I think is really cool. And I don't know why did I think it was your second slide?
Maybe, okay, I don't know. I'm not sure.
Anyway, we can talk about it later.
Yeah.
Because no one is following it. Anyway, really interesting because that's such a powerful rock art panel.
Yeah.
And there's so many different things going on.
Yeah.
And I never knew that this is also a place for women.
Yes.
But clearly it is.
Yeah,
There it is, right up top.
this one.
Yep, that's the picture. So right at the very top, the highest most one, that's fir needles. And that's a very common Coast Salish motif where a young woman would go and train and they would actually take a fir needle and then pick the needles off like this to strengthen their fingers. And so there's maybe a half dozen in Shishal territory, which is just over the mountain.
Yep, yep.
So it doesn't surprise me at all. So it's interesting that this is a place of obsidian, it's a place of other things, other amazing rock art, and it looks like maybe some graffiti.
Yeah,
But then also this amazing female
yeah.
pictograph.
This is actually a pictograph at Furry Creek.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's on House Sound.
Yep.
And it's associated with transformer history.
Yeah.
You can see the sort of 4 lines. Those are actually the 4 Hahais, or Transformer Brothers. But one of my other grad students, my grad student, she used the XRF on looking at the ochre, or the tummuth.
Yeah.
And we couldn't determine what source of ochre that this material came from, but she was able to say there are different ochres here, so there were multiple uses or multiple events of how this pictograph panel came to be. And so it's a powerful place. I'm sure both men and women came, but when can I get a copy of that thesis?
Yeah, I can send it to you. It's great. Yeah.
Cool.
Well, let's all raise our hands to Rudy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Angela?
Just before you all go,
We're all high tech here.
Yes, we are. Thank you. I just have a quick minute of your time, if I will. I just want to present Dr. Rudy Reimer-Yumsk with a small gift of our appreciation.
Wow.
For coming all the way out here to Saskatchewan, although the weather's beautiful, isn't it? We lucked out. And telling us about his wonderful research and his knowledge and sharing all of that with us. So thank you very much, Rudy Reimer.